The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. It drummed against the funeral home windows like 1,000 tiny fists, a relentless beat that echoed the hollow rhythm of my breaking heart. My parents lay side by side, at peace in a way I hadn't seen in years. As I stood there in my black dress, my 3 children pressed close, a wave of grief so profound it felt like I was drowning. That's when he leaned in, my husband of 2 decades, the man who had promised to love me through joy and sorrow. His hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture that looked like support to everyone else, but his whisper was a killing blow, colder than the grave itself. "I want a divorce, Jane. It's over." Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jane Miller, and for the last 2 decades, I lived a life defined by the promises I made and the promises I was made. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. A steady, mournful rhythm drumming against the funeral home windows. It echoed the hollow ache in my chest, a grief so profound it felt like I was drowning. My parents lay side by side, at peace in a way I hadn't seen in years. Mom's long battle with cancer had finally ended, and 2 weeks later, Dad's broken heart had followed. As I stood there in my black dress, my 3 children pressed close, a wave of profound sorrow washed over me. That's when he leaned in, my husband Alex of 20 years, the man who had promised to love me through joy and sorrow. His hand rested on my shoulder, a gesture that looked like support to everyone else, but his whisper was a killing blow, colder than the grave itself. "I want a divorce, Jane. It's over." The world didn't stop. The rain didn't stop. My heart, which had been cracking for months, simply shattered. I turned to look at him, my mind unable to process the words. But there was no warmth in his cold gray eyes, no regret, just a sterile impatience, as if my parents' funeral was a business meeting he couldn't wait to leave. "What did you say?" My voice was barely a whisper. "You heard me," he replied, straightening the expensive silk tie I had bought him for our anniversary. "We'll discuss the details at home. Just try to keep it together for the kids." Then he walked away, leaving me standing alone, feeling more abandoned than I had ever felt in my life. The ghost of the man I thought I married stood shaking hands with my uncle, his smile perfectly practiced, while I stood surrounded by mourners, utterly alone. He had chosen the worst day of my life to betray me, a day he knew I would be too devastated to fight back. But in his calculation, Alex had forgotten one crucial detail. He had forgotten who I was beneath the grieving daughter, the devoted wife, the gentle mother. He had forgotten that I was an architect by trade, a woman who built things, and when necessary, a woman who knew how to dismantle them. He had forgotten that I was my father's daughter, and my father had taught me that sometimes. The only way to survive a predator is to become one yourself. Before the silence of the funeral, our life had been a slow, creeping rot. I met Alex when I was 25, a fresh graduate from my master's program in architectural design. He was 32, a charismatic and ambitious real estate broker at one of Chicago's most prestigious firms. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. "You're different," he told me on our third date. "Most women just talk about themselves, but you actually listen. You care about things that matter." I believed him. We married 2 years later. My father, a proud blue-collar man, walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, whispering, "He better take care of my little girl, or he'll answer to me." For a while, Alex did. He was ambitious and driven, and together we bought our first house, a modest colonial in the suburbs. When our first child, our daughter Maya, was born, Alex insisted I stay home. "A mother's love can't be replaced," he said, kissing my forehead as our new daughter slept in my arms. I gave up my career, my blueprints and designs, to throw myself into motherhood with the same intensity. Then our son, Sam, came 2 years later, all elbows and energy, followed by our surprise baby, Lily. With each child, my purpose felt clearer. Alex worked longer hours to support our growing family, and I dedicated myself to being the perfect wife and mother. But somewhere along the way, something changed. It started with small comments about dinner being too salty or the house being too messy, the sighs when the children were too loud during his important phone calls. He stopped asking about my day, stopped noticing when I wore something new. "Jane, can you keep it down?" became his most common phrase. "Jane, where did you put my—" I became a ghost in my own home, a silent manager of his life. I told myself it was stress. His job was demanding, and he was providing for us. The least I could do was be understanding. I made excuses when he missed Maya's school play or Sam's championship game. I told myself marriage was work, a mantra my mother had often repeated. But this wasn't work. This was slowly dying, one indifference at a time. This indifference festered and began to show in public. A month before my parents' health declined, Alex insisted we attend a prestigious charity gala. It was his world, filled with polished people in expensive clothes. He was at the top of his game, and I was just the accessory he brought along. As he introduced me to his colleagues, he didn't say, "This is my wife, Jane." He said, "This is Jane. She manages our home so I can focus on my business." His voice had a condescending edge, as if my work were a trivial hobby. One woman, a sharp-eyed investor named Eleanor, asked me, "You're a Miller any relation to the famous architect firm?" Alex quickly jumped in. "Oh, no, Jane's been a homemaker for years. She has no idea what that world is like." A small, bitter laugh caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to correct him, but instead I just smiled and nodded. His casual dismissal was a dagger to my heart, a public unveiling of his disrespect. He didn't just forget my identity, he actively erased it. I saw how he looked at the women in the room, the ones who were in his field. Their eyes were on him, and he returned their gaze with a hunger I hadn't seen in years. That night, I cried in my car, not because of what he had said, but because I realized he saw me as nothing more than a burden. The burden was a role I played well, but my children were paying the price. Little Lily was our most innocent victim. One afternoon, she proudly brought me a drawing. It was a picture of our family, with Alex in his suit, the kids playing, and me in the center, a huge smile on my face, holding what looked like a blueprint. "It's you, Mommy," she exclaimed. "You're building us a happy house." I smiled, tears stinging my eyes. But when she showed it to Alex that evening, his reaction was chilling. He glanced at it, then scowled. "What is this?" "Lily, why are you drawing on my important papers?" He didn't see a child's imagination. He saw an interruption. He then looked at me. "Jane, what have you been telling her? This is ridiculous. Our children should be focused on things that matter, not on some silly drawings." He tore the paper and threw it in the trash. The look on Lily's face was one of utter devastation. It wasn't just my past he wanted to bury. He was actively destroying the future our children envisioned with me in it. That night, I retrieved the torn drawing from the garbage, taped it back together, and hid it in a drawer. It became a secret, painful testament to all the things he had stolen from me, and a quiet promise to myself that I would one day reclaim them. The final months before my parents' deaths were the worst. Alex had become a stranger living in our house. He spoke to me like I was his employee, giving orders, expecting compliance, showing no warmth or affection. When my mom got sick, he barely acknowledged it. When she went into hospice, he couldn't be bothered to visit. "I'm not good with that stuff. Jane, you handle it." So I handled it alone. I held my mom's hand through the chemo, slept in hospital chairs, and fed my dad when grief made him forget to eat. As my father's health failed, Alex began to talk about their inheritance. He didn't ask. He demanded, "Jane, your father needs to get his affairs in order. We can use the money to pay down my business loans. It's a great investment for our family." The word "our" felt like a lie, a bitter joke. He pressured me to have my ailing father sign away his assets, talking about spreadsheets and tax shelters while I was sitting in a hospice room, trying to make my mother's last moments comfortable. His casual cruelty was breathtaking. He saw my grief not as a human experience, but as a financial opportunity. The night before my parents' funeral, I was sitting in the kitchen, unable to sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of grief and exhaustion. I heard voices from Alex's home office. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear him on the phone with what I assumed was his lawyer. "No, this is perfect," he said, his voice low and confident. "With both parents gone, Jane is in a state of emotional shock. She won't know what hit her. We file the papers tomorrow. She'll be too distraught to even read them." He laughed, a short, callous sound that made my blood run cold. "She'll just sign whatever I tell her to. This is the cleanest way out. I can transfer all the failing assets to her name and walk away with a clean slate. She'll be so busy grieving. She'll never even realize she's taken on all my debt." The man I had loved, the man who was the father of my children, had just revealed his grand design to ruin me. My body froze. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was a target. My grief had not broken me. It had hardened me. My brain, the one that had designed towering skyscrapers and intricate structures, clicked into place. I started with the laptop I had bought for him a few years ago. I knew exactly where to begin. Every night after the children were asleep, I stayed up. I began to comb through his business files, his emails, his financial records. He had always been so proud of his complicated deals, his use of leverage and loans. I remembered helping him with the early drafts of his contracts. The way he laughed and said I had a mind for this stuff. Now, I put that mind to work. The numbers didn't lie. His company was a house of cards, built on enormous debt and risky investments that were on the verge of collapsing. The divorce wasn't just an escape. It was a desperate, calculated move to transfer his debt to me and the kids. He had planned to leave me with nothing but the mortgage on a crumbling house and the crushing weight of his failure. It was a viciously clever plan. But it was also his biggest mistake. He had forgotten that I had helped him build the foundation. I reached out to David, a friend from my college days who had become a respected corporate lawyer. We met at a quiet cafe far from our neighborhood. As I laid out the documents, the spreadsheets, and the emails, he listened intently, his expression growing more and more grim. "Jane," he said, I can't even put it into words. It's not just a bad business deal. This is fraud. And he was going to pin it all on you." I felt a cold satisfaction. I hadn't been imagining his cruelty. I had the proof. Over the next week, David and I worked in secret. We meticulously documented every fraudulent transaction, every hidden loan, every empty promise. My skills as an architect, which I had abandoned so long ago, were now the very tools I would use to deconstruct his life. The foundation he thought was solid was nothing but a web of lies, and I knew exactly where to cut the support beams. The confrontation came a week later. Alex came home carrying a manila envelope. He found me in the kitchen, calmly making tea. "Jane," he said, his voice slick and condescending, "we need to talk. I've had my lawyer draw up the papers. It's all fair and amicable. A clean break." He slid a document across the table. "I'm doing this to protect you and the kids. You know." He was so confident, so sure of himself. He thought I would be too broken to even read the papers. But I had been preparing for this moment. I looked him dead in the eyes, a calm I hadn't felt in years settling over me. "Alex, I know," I said. His smile faltered. "I know everything." I slid my own folder across the table, a thin, unassuming document that contained all the evidence of his deceit. "Your company is bankrupt. All those investments you said were for our family were a house of cards. And I've already shared the details with the judge. They've signed an emergency order to freeze your accounts." The color drained from his face. His composure finally cracked, replaced by a flash of disbelief and rage. You can't," he stammered, his voice thick with panic. "I am your wife, Alex, and I am the mother of your children. I was also the architect of your early success, a fact you seem to have forgotten." He lunged for the papers, but I was faster. I pulled them away and stood up, the power dynamic in the room shifting for the first time in years. "I filed for divorce," I said, my voice steady, "but it won't be on your terms. I'm taking everything you were planning to give away, and you can keep the debt you so carefully planned for me." He was speechless, completely undone. That night, he slept on the couch in his office, his world crumbling around him while my children and I slept peacefully in the house we had built together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Alex was found to be financially and professionally liable for his debts and schemes. The company he had built was dismantled, its assets sold to pay off what they could. But it was nowhere near enough. He, the man who had always been so polished and professional, was left with nothing. He lost the house, his car, and his reputation. The news spread quickly among our social circles, and the whispers turned from pity for me to open disgust for him. I, on the other hand, felt a new sense of freedom. The cold, heavy feeling that had suffocated me for years was gone. The woman who had died at the cemetery was buried, and the woman who had risen in her place was ready to build again. I reopened my architectural firm, taking on small but meaningful projects at first, and then, with the help of David, larger ones. The money I earned was my own, and it was enough. Just a few months after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my new office, a small, sunlit space I had rented downtown. I was sketching a new design, my mind alive with ideas, when the receptionist buzzed me. "Jane," she said, "there's a man here to see you. He says it's urgent." I knew before she even said his name. Alex walked in, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face thin and drawn. He looked a decade older, defeated. He didn't have his usual swagger or his perfectly practiced smile. He was broken. "Jane," he started, his voice a pathetic whisper. "I've lost everything. I don't know what to do. The bank is calling. I'm a mess." He took a step toward me, his hands outstretched. "Please, Jane, you have a mind for this. Help me. You can fix this, just like you fixed everything else." I looked at him, not with hate, but with a detached pity. I saw the man who had abandoned me when I was at my lowest, who had tried to leave me with his failures. I saw the man who had hurt my children, and who had looked at my family as a burden to be discarded. I didn't say a word. I simply looked at him, a silent, unblinking presence. Then, without a sound, I turned back to my desk, picked up my pencil, and continued to sketch. I didn't owe him an explanation. I didn't owe him an apology. I didn't owe him a single word. His pleas became more desperate, but I didn't look up. He had chosen to be the man who wanted to destroy me, and I had chosen to be the woman who would walk away, leaving him with the ruins he had built for himself. My life was no longer defined by his promises or his betrayals. It was my own, a testament to the strength I had rediscovered in the rubble. He had asked for a divorce at my parents' funeral. Weeks later, I left him bankrupt and begging. My silence was the final chapter, a quiet, powerful end to a story that needed no more words.